Good evening, Dr. Munyarati, Chair of the Department of Peace, Security and Society, representing the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, Dr. Finance Management, our host, members of the Agrarian South Network, the family and friends of the late Professor Moyo, Madam Bianchi Tetua, Walter Champati, and staff members of my friends and collaborators of my members of the Ideas Network, and students from the Ideas course, friends here in Harare and online, I wish to warmly welcome you to the 7th Moyo Memorial Lecture, which is taking place at the University of Zimbabwe here in Harare on this 6th day of February 2024. My name is John Chikata. I'm a professor of development studies at SOAS at the University of London, and I'm serving as the chair for education. First of all, I want to invite our host, Dr. Munyarati Nyakudia, to welcome us to the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Before I start, let me do a bit of some housekeeping. For our convenience, we can use the stairs up there. We can use the engine that you came in through, then it needs to go behind the building. My name is already stated, is I'm the chairman of the Department of Peace, Security and Society in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities in the University. And I'm here representing the Dean, who unfortunately on another assignment. Director of Moyo African Institute of Agrarian Studies, Chapati. Our guest, Professor Boy. Allow me, ladies and gentlemen, to write in protocols already given. If Professor Mangena was here, he was going to say, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the University of Zimbabwe for this august event. The university prides itself in being a center of strategic research, innovation, and knowledge sharing. As you may be aware, the university has over the past few years transformed from education 3.0 to the more encompassing education 5.0 philosophy, whose thrust is focused on research and innovative approaches geared towards problem solving, value creation, and industrialization to address contemporary challenges facing society. The university is guided by its 2019-2025 strategic plan, some of whose objectives speak to collaborative relationships in knowledge generation and the development of strategic partnerships to leverage knowledge sharing, resource mobilization, and investment for advancement of innovative research, outreach, teaching, and business development. In this endeavor, the university therefore sees this lecture as an important opportunity not only to celebrate and preserve the legacy of Professor Moyo, a renowned theoretical researcher who contributed immensely in shaping the debate on Zimbabwe's land reform, but also a platform to enhance further research in agrarian studies. Agriculture is the backbone of the country's economy as it plays a critical role in people's livelihoods, from providing food, jobs, and raw materials for trade, among others. The lecture could not have come any more opportune time. What with the ravages of climate change currently affecting the current agricultural system? There's a lot of anxiety, as not less than 80% of Zimbabweans' livelihoods are threatened. We are therefore excited that Professor Gosh's lecture focuses primarily on rural and urban industrialization as a means towards poverty alleviation and food security and sustainability. We anticipate that, as Professor Gosh teases out the question how the global majority will cope under the weight of climate imperialism, the lecture will help identify niches that will lead to research that goes a long way in pointing to evidence-based research that enhance Nation 5.0 dictates on innovation and industrialization in the agrarian field. Ultimately, the outcome should be impactful research strategies that enhance livelihoods of agrarian communities in the era of climate imperialism. I wish you fruitful deliberations. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yakutia. Please extend our appreciation to the Dean, Professor Mangena, and assure him and your colleagues that we have the same objectives as you in coming here to collaborate on this lecture. So we hope that this succeeds, and this is only the beginning of the we reach. Before I proceed, I want to say a little about how we're going to proceed this evening. So I'm going to introduce the lecture and the lecture, after which the lecture will be delivered. Then there will be an opportunity for a question and answer, 30 minutes opportunity. And then we basically hand back. So let me move on to introduce the lecture and the lecture. So the Moyo Memorial Lecture was instituted by the Agrarian South Network and the Moyo Africa Institute for Agrarian Studies, SMILES, in honor of the vision, leadership, and humanity for the late Professor Moyo, who tragically became an ancestor in November 2020. Professor Moyo was the founding trustee and executive director of the Africa Institute for Agrarian Studies, and the institute was renamed in his honor as the Moyo Africa Institute for Agrarian Studies. Sam was also the founding editor-in-chief for the international journal known as Agrarian South, Journal of Western Economy. He was the president of the Pan-African Research Institution, the Council for the Development of Social Science in Africa. He was a leading expert on the political economy of development in Africa. At the time of his death, he had over 100 publications in his credit in a career spanning more than 35 years of research and teaching on rural development issues, focus on land reform, agrarian change, environmental policy, and social movements. But Professor Moyo was much more besides this. He was the moving spirit behind the Agrarian South Network, which he tirelessly worked with others to build and sustain. He was an exemplary leader, a teacher, a comrade, a brother, a friend to many of us, a beloved son, a father, a brother, a life partner, a son of the Zimbabwe, a citizen of the world. Initiated in 2018, the major aim of this lecture series was to sustain the legacy of Moyo, promoting debates on land and agrarian issues, the agrarian political economy, and their implications for the lives of working people of the global south. The memorial lecture is a platform to present and debate ideas from leading scholars of the progressive public intellectual tradition that Professor Moyo made his own. It is also a space for teachers, students, researchers, activists, and the general public to think together about the development challenges of time. The inaugural Moyo Memorial Lecture was delivered in January 2018 by Emeritus Professor Prabhat on the topic globalization in the peasantry in the South. Since then, we have had leading progressive intellectuals and scholar activists such as Professor Emeritus Mwadini Isashimji, Professor Zenebego Tadesse, Professor Michael Witter, Dr. Yao Graham, and Professor Utsa Patnai deliver lectures. We continue in this great tradition this evening with this seventh lecture to be delivered by Professor Jayati Ghosh on the topic development in the time of climate experience, how can the global majorities cope? Let me briefly introduce our lecturer, who I believe needs no introduction. The article taught economics at the Nehru University, New Delhi for nearly 35 years, and is currently professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Of several international boards and commissions, including the UN High-Level Advisory Board on Economic Institutions, the WHO Council on the Economics of Health for All, and the UN Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism. She writes regularly for popular media.
Presentation. Thank you so much, Georgie, for that very excessive introduction, and thank you also for inviting me, all of you, to deliver this lecture. You know, it's for all of us who've known Sam, it is a very emotional thing to be delivering a lecture in his memory, because Sam he was a bit like a meteor. He was this bright spark that kind of went across the sky and was quite extraordinary in so many ways. Of course, for his brilliance, for his incredible sharpness and the ability to cut through to the essence of things, for the insights and the profundity of his vision, but also for his courage, his integrity, his charm, his humor. He was quite an extraordinary person, and we were also lucky to have known him. I can only begin to imagine what Beatrice, well, we've all lost, but you know, we all feel really deeply emotional at the very idea that we remember Sam and greatly value everything that we've learned from him, including how to be truly a human being. I think Georgie mentioned that he was such an amazing human being. Okay, I'm going to talk about something that I believe Sam would have also held dear to his heart, because among the many things he was also deeply anti-colonial and anti-imperialist. And I'm going to try and identify some of the ways in which, so do I use this? No, which thing do I use? No, sorry about this, to be incompetent. Is it this one? No, what do I press? Go to the next slide. Okay, maybe you can just go to the next slide. Thank you. Yeah. All right, and so first let's ask ourselves, what exactly do I mean by climate imperialism? What is climate imperialism? And I want to clarify that imperialism is not the same as colonialism. Okay, colonialism could potentially be one of the forms of imperialism, but I'm using imperialism in the way that Lenin did, and also Prabhat Patnaik developed further, which is really the struggle of large capital over economic territory when it is assisted by their states. Okay, and thank you so much. So this struggle of large capital over economic territory can take many, many different forms. And of course, economic territory itself takes many different forms. So of course there's land. And of course there are the resources extracted from nature. I think in Africa, I don't have to repeat the importance of that. But it's also the fact that you get access labor, both paid and unpaid labor, to different degrees. It is the fact that you get access to markets and you can wipe out domestic producers. You can actually get profits from selling in different ways that were not possible before. Particularly in the late 20th century, we've had a whole range of new commodities emerge. Newly privatized services, for example, the privatization of, let's say, electricity and water, the privatization of knowledge, which was not something that was earlier really seen as something to be commercialized, but is now very much like intellectual property rights are very much part of the way in which imperialism operates. And of course, now we have cyberspace as a new form of economic territory as well, with all kinds of implications that really we have to work out. But I'm going to focus on climate imperialism. And so what does that mean? Basically, I think that in this neoliberal phase of capitalism, broadly, the last 3 decades of the last century, the first decade, the current century, ongoing phase, the human interaction with the planet and with nature has emerged as one of the most significant ways in which imperialism, as I have defined it, is playing out. And this is strongly associated with the kinds of things we associate with colonialism, in other words, with violence, with direct attempts at control, but it is also associated with economic forces that make use of a global legal architecture, an architecture that comes from trade agreements, it comes from other bilateral treaties that are bilateral and plurilateral treaties that are signed. It comes from arrangements around sovereign debt as well. And all of these play into a particular way of dealing with, creating and dealing with the ways in which the climate change occurs and the ways in which we then have to address it. Okay. What do I do? Which one? What do I do? It's not, which is the one that I pressed? Sorry about this. No, this has gone back to, no, this is not what I want. I want to move to the next slide. Sorry about this, but. Yeah, okay, can you make it full screen now? Thank you. Can you make it full screen, please? Thank you. And will you just show me which one to press to move to the next slide? Forgive me for being technologically challenged about this. Which one do I press? Okay, all right. So, no, I need to go back. So, what does it mean to say climate imperialism? How is it expressed? Essentially, it is the fact that a relatively small population in the advanced countries, in the rich world, have over time been able to produce and consume in ways that are extremely damaging to the planet and to climate, okay? And they have done this by essentially increasing global carbon emissions in a way that is now proving to be unsustainable, okay? At the same time, however, the ways in which it's now sought to be dealt with, now that everybody recognizes that it's a problem and you've got to do something about it, the ways that it's sought to be dealt with are essentially national, and they are treating all countries equally, irrespective of what are either the current or the past patterns that have led to the problem that we are facing today. Okay, so the historic responsibilities ignored, but also even the current responsibilities are not really fully taken into account. And in turn, the operations of global finance, much of which is based in the developed world, as well as large multinational companies, all operate to further increase the carbon emissions At the same time, the kinds of finance and technologies that the rest of the world will need, the global majority countries would need to try and actually mitigate and adapt to these changes is not being made available, okay, broadly. The imposition of intellectual property rights, what I am calling privatized knowledge, is an absolutely crucial link in this because it really prevents countries from accessing the necessary technologies that we need to actually change things. And the fact that we are actually getting a very dramatic and rapid shift in terms of new technologies for green production means that we now need new minerals. Here in Zimbabwe, for example, you're already very much aware of the fact that lithium has become this source of great interest and a potential, once again, I would argue, for different kinds of resource grab. Okay, just to give you a bit of bad news. Now, this is an old report of the IPCC, but why am I quoting a report that is almost 2 years old now? Because, in fact, there's been a systematic attempt to edit and tone down the IPCC reports because it was decided that they are too alarmist. They're telling people that things are really bad and that you've got to do something immediately, you don't have any time. And they were getting actually more and more serious about this over time. This is the last one where they were really allowed to come out unedited. I'm serious. I have met with IPCC people writing who have said that we've just kept out huge chunks of the report. We are not even telling you the full extent of what we are finding, simply because it's really just seen as unacceptable. Too much bad news. So what did that report tell us? This is 1.5 years ago. It's saying that already there is substantial damage from climate change. We don't need to, we are all aware of that. But in fact, the extent and the magnitude are significantly larger than the IPCC itself had anticipated. In other words, each report progressively underestimated the extent of the damage. So when they say, this much will happen with 1.5 degrees and so on, that was already an underestimate. Climate changes were occurring at a faster rate and more dramatically at lower increases in temperature, at 1.2. which is where we are now, above the pre-industrial level. Already we are seeing changes that they had not anticipated. In fact, one of the IPCC scientists, in fact, told us that, listen, we are seeing the melting of the Arctic and Antarctic ice caps at unprecedented rates, and none of our models can take this into account. We really, frankly, don't know what will happen. We have no idea because it is beyond our ability to actually model this and the implications of this, not just for seawater rise and broader changes, but all kinds of other changes to marine life, changes to the global temperature, all kinds of things that could happen. Some of the losses, this is what they said in 2022, are already irreversible. There are natural species that are lost. There are parts of the planet that are currently uninhabitable. There are places that are no longer cultivable. Some are close to happening, some irreversible changes, what they call tipping points, are close to happening. And of course, all of this has very significant adverse consequences, not just on the planet, on nature, but on people and on all other forms of life, plant and animal life, right? And I don't need to elaborate, you can guess, and including on health and everything else, okay? And we are getting humanitarian crises in places where the climate crises interact with other types of high vulnerability. And this is going to become more clear as we progress. The other thing that they mentioned, and this is something that is not taken up in future, which is really interesting. Again, something I believe that was more or less censored out of the IPCC discussions, is the possibilities of maladaptation. So we know adaptation is very unequal. Rich countries can afford to spend much more. They can do different things. Even some of the poorer or developing world can actually manage to adapt. Very large parts of the global majority countries don't have the resources to actually ensure adaptation. But what does adaptation mean? A lot of the adaptation actually adds to the problem. That's what they call maladaptation. It's very hot, so everybody in Nevada goes into air conditioning. In Nevada, they can afford it, air condition everything inside, but that actually adds to the problem. Similarly, you build seawalls because you're worried about the rising sea level. That adds to the problem, and so on. The IPCC identified 16 different kinds of maladaptation, which they said were already a serious problem by 2022. Subsequently, they haven't talked about this at all, so we don't know how much worse they've got, but presumably they have got worse. Now, here's the thing that, you would think that climate change is a global problem. I mean, just like the pandemic was a global problem, except that it wasn't. Similarly, climate change, the climate does not respect passports and borders and visas and so on. It changes, right? And it can change and have all kinds of effects everywhere. You would think that therefore people across the world would be thinking about this globally. Unfortunately, that has not happened. The way this happens is through international negotiations that are really a conference of parties. The COPs, the conference of parties that change, that present countries negotiating about how, or promising changes about how they are going to deal with this problem, okay? Now, essentially, every country is assigned a climate responsibility. And that climate responsibility is on the basis of their current production of carbon emissions. Production-based carbon emissions, how much do you produce in total? That's your responsibility. You've got to get to net zero by whichever year you promise to get to net zero. All of you countries together have to move towards that net zero. Now, clearly this ignores historic responsibility, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a bit. But there are many other ways in which it is actually messed up, okay? So this climate responsibility, also countries are assigned in terms of how rich or poor they are. And the way the GDP is measured is in terms of the purchasing power parity exchange rate. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. There are the market exchange rates, right? Which is so many Zimbabwe dollar to the US dollar. That's the market exchange rate. That's the one that functions. And the purchasing power parity is it's a construct. It's a completely synthetic measure which assesses how much the Zimbabwe dollar can buy in the country compared to how much it could buy in the US, let's say, or how much the Indian rupee could buy in India relative to, let's say, $1 in the US, which is 80 Indian rupees approximately. 80 rupees in India will buy you a lot more than $1 in the US, okay? So the PPP exchange rate, the purchasing power parity exchange rate for the Indian rupee is 4 times higher than the market exchange rate, okay? Obviously, this is overstating the incomes of the poor countries. You're really pushing them up by that factor. And let's ask ourselves, how come we can buy so much more in India with 80 rupees? It's because we have workers and people at getting even lower wages. The only reason it's cheaper is because you have people with really low wages willing to give you goods and services at that lower price. So it's like a double whammy for the country, right? You're very poor, so you have all these poor people with very low wages, and then you're told, oh, because of that, you're not so poor, because you're getting the goods and services cheaper. So anyway, PPP measures are used, and that in turn inflates the incomes of lower income countries, another way of adding to their responsibility relative to the average. The measures are based on how much carbon emissions occur within your country for production, not for consumption, okay? But we also know that the rich countries have shifted a lot of the really carbon emitting production to other countries, especially China, but not only China, to a bunch of other countries. And then, because it's absolutely right, there's been big increases in carbon emissions in both China and India. And so in every COP, progressively, there's a big noise being made about that. Say, oh, China is now the biggest emitter and it's terrible. And India is now the 3rd biggest emitter. So they have to cut down their own emissions. We're not going to solve this problem until China and India solve this problem, okay? All right, so let's just look at the historical emissions. The European Union, this is just in terms of the this is, of course, I mean, there's an estimate based on all kinds of assumptions, but nonetheless, It's for the period from the mid-19th century to the end of the first decade of the 21st century. Okay, so 1850 to 2011. And you can see that about 85% of carbon emission historic responsibility comes from a small set of countries, US, European Union, Japan, etc., accounting for 14% of the global population. Okay? 14% of the global population today come from countries which historically have added to 85% of the problem. Okay? Now, you could say that, wait a minute, in the 19th century, nobody knew about carbon emissions, nobody knew global warming was a thing. You can't blame your ancestors for things that happened which nobody had any idea about. Fine, except that more than half of the emissions occur in the last 30 years of this period, when everybody knew. By 1980, everybody knew. I mean, it was well known that this is a problem, that this is already happening, and there were strategies to reduce it were already known as well. And yet, more than half of these emissions happened in the last 30 years. Okay. So let's look a little bit at this. How do we determine carbon emissions? And there are many different methods, okay? One is what I just described to you, the production-based. Whatever happens within your national borders, whatever production occurs, however much carbon it produces, that's your responsibility, okay? Of course, trade is left out, as I just mentioned. Yeah? Trade here does not include this. Then there are people who've said, no, we should look at extraction-based, on the grounds that, the real problem comes from fossil fuels. The biggest carbon emission concern is from fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, etc. So let's just look at the life cycle of that. Who's producing it, who's, at the different stages of processing, and assign the carbon responsibility there, okay? An even more sophisticated attempt is you look at the value added, who's getting the most value added out of this carbon emission at each point, and you say they are the ones responsible. And then there's the more simple one saying, well, just look at the consumption based. That is, you look at production plus imports. How much are you actually consuming that ends up emitting carbon? And say that that's the responsibility you have. And I would argue that that is actually probably the most sensible way of assigning the responsibility. Okay, so let's look at the production-based emitters. And this is what all the COPs use, okay? Every COP is based on these numbers. And these are the biggest emitters in the world. These together account for 80% of current global emissions. So as you can see, China, okay, the blue line is for, I think it's for 2000. And the orange line is for 2019, just before the pandemic, okay? Because as we know, the pandemic period kind of messed things up. And you can see how China goes from being the second largest, but still not such a large, to way ahead. It's just zoomed ahead in terms of the total metric tons, yeah? 10,175 million metric tons. The United States was the largest emitter, and it's now the second largest emitter, but it's now almost like half of the China thing, right? So yeah, that's a big shift. There's no question about it. India, again, was number 6 in 2000. It's now number 3, and it's around half of the US, okay? So yeah, there is definitely a case that China and India have suddenly emerged as very large emitters of carbon, and it's a concern. A lot of the other countries are either fossil fuel producing countries or very rich developed countries who, with very small populations, but nonetheless, their whole pattern of production is such that they emit a lot of carbon. But then let's look at it per capita. That was the total. So per capita, you get quite a different story. Okay, this is still production, by the way. So the US is now among the top. And it's there with Saudi Arabia, which is basically an oil exporter, and Australia, which is a mineral exporter. Okay? But China is less than half of the US in per capita terms. Even today, India is only 2 metric tons per person. Okay, so it's really small in relation to all of the others. Yeah, the European countries come out much worse once you make it per capita, but the US particularly. Now let's look at consumption, because we know that international trade is a big driver still. It was much worse until about 2005. It's come down since then, but even so, international trade is a major way in which the rich countries have managed to palm off their carbon responsibility, okay, by shifting a lot of the production. And once again, the big shift is China. So the gray line, the gray bars here are the difference between the production and the final demand emissions, okay? So if it's negative, it means you're importing a lot of stuff which is produced in a very carbon emitting way, yeah? And so if it's positive, if it's on the right-hand side, then you are exporting that stuff. So you're producing it, and so you're seen as responsible, but you're not consuming that yourself, you're producing. And as you can see, the real game here is that the US is the major importer, if you like, of carbon emitting production in the net, and China is the major exporter of carbon emitting production in the net. But all the other countries, like, you know, India for sure, but even South Africa, Russia, China, everybody is exporting. And then there are the European countries and US who are importing the stuff. In other words, they have managed to push a lot of the responsibility and the carbon emissions to other countries. Okay, all right. What does that mean in terms of per capita emissions by consumption? And now we get the real picture. So the US is way ahead of everybody else at 18.2 metric tons per year, okay? Japan is there, Germany is high, the European countries are generally high. India, it's only 1.5 metric tons per year in terms of consumption, okay? So you can see that this whole thing that, oh, China and India are the ones responsible for everything, really quite a major shift. And the China is out there, I think it's 6.3, no, it's 5.3. Oh, it's hidden. The green you are screen sharing, it's about that, okay? That's, so it's really, once you recognize that consumption emissions is the thing you should look for, and you should look at it per capita, you get a very different picture. But here's the thing, this is not part of the negotiations at the COPs at all. Not per capita and not consumption-based. Okay, now let's look at what's going to happen. I already told you, I gave you the bad news from the IPCC. I'm not a big believer in GDP myself. I think it's a terrible measure of anything. But insofar as people have estimated, now this is what is likely to happen by the end of this century in terms of GDP losses. The pinker you are, the darker the pink, the worse your losses, okay? And no surprises, guess which is the worst affected? Where we are right now, okay? In Africa, and of course, large parts of Latin America, Central America, South Asia, pretty much global majority countries, we are the worst affected, okay? Slightly less affected, China, Australia, US, and very little affected in the extreme north. Here is a UNICEF estimate of the kinds of health risks for children in particular. Again, it's the same story. Extremely high health risk for children, concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Okay? So we are definitely, just in geographical terms, the worst off in terms of this climate change, even though the current emissions are way below the global average. Here's another way of looking at it. This is from the Climate Inequality Report brought out by the Paris Inequality Lab. And this is looking at incomes of the whole world. So it's not by country anymore. It's the bottom half of the global population, the middle 40%, and the top 10% of the global population. So let's look first at the relative losses. The bottom half of the global population, which is responsible for about 15% of global emissions, is going to bear 76%, 75% of the losses, okay? The top 10% are going to bear 3% of the losses. On the other hand, what is their emissions? That's the green one. The bottom 50%, which is going to bear 75% of the losses, has contributed 12% of the emissions. This is the current. We're not even talking about the past. This is just the current emissions, okay? The middle 40%, well, it's about, they contribute 40% of the emissions, they bear 22% of the losses. But the top 10% contribute nearly half of all emissions, 48% of all emissions, okay? Even though they bear only 3% of the losses. On the other hand, who has the capacity to finance anything? Mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, whatever, it's the top 10%, right? Look at their share of the global wealth, it's 78%. At the bottom 50% have got 2% of the global wealth. So they have no capacity to finance. I am reiterating that, remember, imperialism is not about this country versus that country. It is about global capital and the rich versus everybody else. Okay? And this is something that kind of exemplifies that. But that's the other thing we have to remember is that even within regions, it's the rich in every country that are emitting far more than the poor. And what is really striking out here, okay, East Asia, it's almost 40 metric tons per person in the top 10% of East Asia, okay? Which is much more than the bottom half of even North America or Europe, right? In Europe, the bottom half of the population is emitting only 5.1 metric tons per year. The rich are, but I mean, the rich of East Asia are emitting several multiples of that, right? The rich, even in Southeast and South Asia, are emitting more than the bottom half of the North American population. Similarly, Europe, okay? In other words, all of the rich in Middle East and North Africa and Latin America, everywhere, they are emitting much more than their own people, poor, of course, but they're even emitting more than the bottom 50% of every region. Yeah? So it's really not about this country versus that country. It is about the rich. And the problem is with the rich, okay? So that really means that this whole thing that is always presented, because by the way, the other thing that has happened, I should have mentioned, is that the bottom 50% of the world, in the past 15 years, their emissions have come down, okay? On the other hand, the top 10%, the emissions have zoomed. And the top 1%, it's just gone berserk. And if you look at the top 0.001%, the Elon Musks of this world and so on, who are flying to the moon and back and all that, it's off the charts, okay? So the real increase in carbon emissions has come from the top 10%. It hasn't come from the bottom 50%, that's actually come down. Okay, so 64% of carbon emissions are due to within country inequality. 2/3 almost is within country inequality across most of the regions, okay? If you wanted to raise everybody up above the poverty line globally, at the moment, $3.2 per day the World Bank uses as a poverty line with this PPP. I don't like that measure, I hate it, but we have these global measures for it. If you wanted to raise that, you would increase global emissions by only 5% if you lifted everybody on the planet above the poverty line. Only 5%, the increase in emissions, okay? On the other hand, as I've already shown you, the top 10% of the world has got 50% of the global emissions at the moment, okay? The 1% of the world, the richest, they have 15% of global emissions. If you actually taxed the centimillionaires of the world, those who have more than $100 million in wealth, and you tax them only 1.5% of their wealth, which frankly they wouldn't notice, right? If you have more than 100 million, would you notice 1.5 goes here and there? That's like a stock market fluctuation. You wouldn't really know about it. You would get $290 billion, okay? Quite a lot to actually deal with at least adaptation needs, because the current estimation of our adaptation needs is 202 billion. So it's a really simple solution when you think about it. And that's also why it's wrong to pose the problem in terms of, development versus climate change mitigation, which is the way it's often presented to us. And, when my own government says, oh, well, we can't do climate change stuff because we need to develop. We need to make sure everybody has electricity, et cetera, et cetera. That's fine. There should not be a contradiction. There need not be a contradiction. Because, you can choose a pattern of development that reduces the energy consumption per unit of GDP, that shifts to activities that require less energy. And then within energy, you change the type of energy you use. You shift away from coal, the dirtier types of fuel, coal and oil, to natural gas, and then to hydroelectric, and then to renewable, okay, which is the best form. In other words, it's possible to do that. And in fact, now renewable technology, thanks to China's massive investments, is actually relatively cheap. You can do decentralized solar and wind energy generation relatively cheaply. But of course, it means lots of other things. It means you have to change how you're urbanizing. It means that you have to change how you organize your economies and societies. But obviously, we have to do something, because otherwise, as I said, we're really heading down a cliff, right? So we really have to do something. A colleague of mine, Bob Polin and Noam Chomsky, I'm sure all of you have heard of him, they have a study in which they've estimated that you could do this with between 1.5 to 2.5% of GDP annually, which again is nothing, right? It's really not that big a deal for major economies. But of course, as I said, in addition to finance, you really need the access to technology. Okay, I don't expect you to look at all of these numbers. The basic point I'm trying to make here is that the climate finance that was promised is completely inadequate. Okay, in 2012, the rich countries said, okay, we're going to give 100 billion a year for climate finance to help you mitigate, and etc. If you remember, there is no year that they have hit 100 billion yet. And this is by adding together everything under the sun: multilateral bank funding, underwriting risks for private companies, blah, blah, blah. You name it, all of that put together, it's only about 60, 70 billion per year. So it's really, they've never managed even that pitiful amount of 100 billion. Let me remind you that the money given to Ukraine for the wars already exceeds 250 billion. The money given to Israel for its wars is again more than 100 billion by one country alone. Okay, the US, which is part of this contribution, for climate finance, it gave 6 billion. Okay, so just to give you a sense of the priorities. Okay, but even that money is a joke. In other words, what they call climate finance is not climate finance. Why? Because there is still, believe it or not, they promised this in 2012. So you would think, okay, you begin with saying the following things are climate finance. They haven't been able to agree. For the last 10 years, the last COP, they were in Dubai, there was a big noise about, okay, let's define it finally. But no agreement on how to define it. Why not? Because then you can get this kind of thing, okay? There was a really interesting investigation by Reuters, which found that, for example, Italy gave subsidies to open chocolate and gelato factories across Southeast Asia. The US financed a coastal hotel expansion in Haiti. I mean, seriously? You're talking about rising sea levels and you're financing a coastal hotel expansion? Why? Because apparently it's protected against the sea rise. Belgium said, okay, there's a film that has been made about, it's a love story, but it's set in the Argentine rainforest. And rainforests are good, right? They have carbon traps and so on and so forth. So that's climate finance. Japan financed a coal plant in Bangladesh, the absolute worst form, dirtiest form of energy. Why? Oh, because, we're making green coal production. And it financed airport expansion in Egypt. Now, we also know that airport expansion is one of the biggest problems. And airplanes are one of the big problems. So, you can say anything is green finance. So that pitiful amount that I told you about includes all of these numbers. So next time someone tells you, oh, so-and-so country is spending so much on climate finance, take it with many buckets of salt, because it's really this kind of stuff going on in there. Meanwhile, fossil fuel subsidies. Now, this is not even some crazy Indian economist. This is the IMF's estimation, okay? Fossil fuel subsidies globally, they are saying 6.8 trillion, 5.8 trillion in 2019, and going to end up at 6.9 trillion by 2025 is the IMF's estimation. But 2019, when they actually had the numbers, it was 5.8 trillion, okay? Of which the US alone is 780 billion. That is, if you count all of the direct and indirect subsidies, because there are many indirect subsidies that don't show up in the budget. So the direct subsidies that show up in the budget are the lower lines down there, the explicit subsidies. But there are all these implicit subsidies as well, okay? So if you have that kind of money going into fossil fuels, obviously private investment also goes into fossil fuels, right? It's really, it's a no-brainer that investment, finance and investment will go to those. Then we have this other form of imperialism, which is kind of adding to the problem, which is the debt crisis, okay? And as we know, low-income countries, around half of them are in either severe debt crisis or they're already defaulting or they're in big trouble, okay? But there are also middle-income countries. Sri Lanka defaulted, it's now going through an IMF program. Pakistan is facing severe stress. Ghana is facing a kind of lots of issues, et cetera, et cetera. There are lots of countries that are also facing debt stress. There have already been 14 defaults since 2020. When you had, for the previous 2 decades, you had only 19 defaults for 2 whole decades, and now in just 2.5 years, you've had 14 defaults. And this is not the first time you've had this kind of synchronized debt crisis across countries. There are reasons for that, we can go back to that. But the reason is not because they have been bad in so-called, the governments have spent too much and that's why they are in debt. Okay, because this is a debt crisis that explodes in 2022, really, okay? The blue line here is the general gross debt of the rich countries. And look at it, their average begins at 103% of GDP. It goes up to 123% of GDP in the pandemic year. It comes down a bit to 112, but it's still very high, okay? They don't have a debt crisis. They're all doing just fine, thank you. The middle-income countries, they spend a bit less. They have a lower debt anyway. The average is 54%, goes up to 66%, stays at around that level at about 68%. But the low-income countries, oh my God, they haven't increased their spending at all. Look at that. Barely increases to less than half of GDP during the pandemic and is stagnant after that. Which means what? Which means you are not spending on the people. You're not giving social protection. You're not doing your social spending. You're not doing any of the things the government should be doing in a pandemic because you're terrified that the capital markets will punish you. And you already have a very large debt. So after all that very good behavior, after being so fiscally disciplined, what do they get? These are the spreads on sovereign debt on the right-hand side. The blue line, which looks like a flat line, why does it look flat? Because it is. That's the average of the advanced economies spread on sovereign debt over the US Fed. Less than 1 basis point. A basis point is 0.1%. Less than 1 basis point, okay? Look at, on the other hand, the average of the low and middle income countries. That's the orange line. And this is after they're being so good, so well behaved, so terrified of capital markets that they will not spend. Look at how the spreads rise up dramatically during the pandemic, come down a bit, and then zoom again after the Ukraine war. None of this is because of anything they've done. It's all because of other stuff happening globally. Yeah, and then of course the rise in interest rates in the US, which means all the money floods back to the US. As a result, look at the share of debt servicing to total social spending. And what's social spending? Health, education, social protection, all of that taken together. And as you can see, the upper middle income countries, they spend almost half of what they spend on all social spending on debt service. The lower middle income countries spend more than they spend on social spending. 104% of total social spending is debt service. But the low income countries, it's 171%. They're spending 1.7 times on debt servicing than they are on all of these critical areas of social spending. So the other terrible thing is that if in fact you are a debtor and you need foreign exchange, then you're desperate to find anything that you can export. And so you will go back to fossil fuels. If you can export fossil fuels, you will definitely do that. In Chad, they were celebrating when they discovered oil because they said, okay, now we can repay some of this debt. Yeah. Okay. It also means that every country is really vulnerable, it's fragile. Even a small change in interest rates, a small shock like a climate shock can make things really bad. And we've seen that countries that have climate shocks, like a lot of the West Indies and so on, your sovereign debt spreads zoom up. So you have a tragedy, you have a major climate catastrophe, and then plus it becomes harder to borrow in the capital markets. So how are we going to fix this? What can we do? Okay, clearly we have to have changes in the global architecture. We have to have, first of all, we shouldn't be using purchasing power parity. We should be using market exchange rates to assess the incomes of countries, which will reduce the so-called responsibility. But we obviously need massively increased climate finance because it should be based on what are called global public investment principles, right? It's a global problem. It's a global public bad, if you like, that is happening. You need global public investment, which means every country contributes according to what they can. And then the money is allocated according to the global need. Where is there the most requirement for mitigation, for adaptation, for loss and damage? Okay. One way of doing this is to get the IMF to issue special drawing rights. The IMF has a liquidity special drawing rights, which is, the US can issue money when it likes, right? US Federal Reserve just does quantitative easing, they issue money. The IMF can also issue SDRs if they want, okay? And what we've been arguing, I was on a commission that was mentioned for the UN, we said it shouldn't just go to all countries according to quota because the rich countries are never going to use those SDRs. They're just going to lie there. Instead, it should be selective. So if you increase, let's say, SDR issuance by 200 billion, spread it around the countries that need it on the basis of climate shock, debt shock, interest rate shock, something that was not their fault, give it to those countries. It's costless. It does not cost any other country anything, okay? It seems to be like an obvious solution, but it's not being implemented. The other thing is that, we need to stop being so reliant on debt because it doesn't really help. You go through the debt cycles, you end up losing much more than you gain. And how do you stop being so reliant? You increase your domestic taxation, including of multinationals who end up not paying what they're supposed to pay because they can transfer all their profits to tax havens, but also including the extreme wealth of individuals. Now, as I've told you, part of the whole climate change problem is because of very rich people. And those rich people are all over. Yes, they're mostly in the US and Europe and Japan, but they're also in China, they're also in India, they're also in Brazil, they're also in South Africa. And we should be actually taxing that wealth because that also reduces some of their extreme carbon emissions as well. We have to regulate and control the finance that is funding brown projects. Simple rule. You could say, okay, if you're going to fund a coal project, you have to put 5 times that money in green renewable project. It's just a rule. It doesn't cost the government anything. It could be done. They have done similar things. Governments have done similar things in the past in many countries. It's not being done. What are they doing instead? They're doing border carbon taxes like the US and the EU, right? They're saying, oh, we are importing this stuff from you, but you're producing it in a very carbon intensive way, which they did, right? They exported, they encouraged that production there so that they would get off the hook. And now they're saying, oh, it's all very carbon intensive. We've got this wonderful new green technology to make steel, cement, etc., and machine tools. We'll use that. But you, because you're using this older technology, we are going to put border tariffs on you. And we're going to reduce our imports from you because now we've got this new green technology. We are not going to share that technology with you, but we're going to put the tariff instead, okay? Essentially, we have to change that system. We have to move away from that and towards a sharing of technology. So what about the mitigation strategies? Are they doing us any good? In other words, is there imperialism also in mitigation? It's not just in terms of how much every country has to do. It's also, is that mitigation strategy itself causing any problems? for the developing world. I think I kind of suggested it already that, the whole climate discussion is pervaded by neocolonialism, really. But now you also have all these new geopolitical constraints. I think some of those constraints could also be challenges, but they are also, could also be opportunities, but they are also challenges, okay? Cap and trade is one of the market-based mechanisms. You know what cap and trade is, right? You can, some country that is not producing a lot of emissions gets these carbon credits. So some other country can buy carbon credit from you, or a company can buy a carbon credit, and they can continue emitting, saying, it's okay, we are funding a forest in Nepal, and that's really reducing carbon emissions, so we don't have to do anything. US, the Inflation Reduction Act, as it's called, or the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. These are the new things that they have brought in. These are basically protectionist devices. They are designed to reduce the potential for industrialization. But then, and I think this is the one that's of particular interest here in Zimbabwe, but in Africa generally, the new resource grabs. Okay, there's lithium required for batteries, there's all the issues associated with the kinds of mining that are done. Because the multinationals that are doing the mining are using forms of extraction that are less expensive here, but are also more ecologically damaging and displacing. And the things which are not allowed in their own countries. So the lithium extraction that's happening in, I think, Arizona in the US is using a very different technology from what they're using in the lithium triangle in Latin America, because they can get away with it, okay? Waste, that's another one. So, I'm currently teaching in the northeast of the US, which is a very progressive part of the US. It's a very progressive area. It's a very progressive university. Everybody's very green and progressive. Everybody recycles. Everybody has solar panels on their doors and windows and everything. And they're all very proud of the fact that they do all this recycling. 90% of the waste that is created in the US is exported to be recycled. And it is then lands up in dumps in our countries in very hazardous and unhealthy circumstances. So that recycling is actually really problematic, but they all think it's all fine and it's wonderful that we're so green and recycling. Private financial markets, because of the subsidies, because of the way things work, they are still basically funding brown investments. I don't know if you've heard of ESG, environmental, social, and governance indicators, which are supposed to encourage private investment to behave well. It's a big scam. And now there are many books. Tariq Fancy, who was involved in doing that himself, has come out and come clean and revealed how exactly that's just complete greenwashing and nonsensical. And the latest thing now is to say, oh, we need so much more money. We need 2 trillion, 3 trillion, 4 trillion. That can't be done by governments. So we have to have blended finance. We have to have de-risking of the private finance. And what that really means is that the public sector, our tax revenues all go into de-risking the private investor, which ends up costing more than if you'd actually just gone there and done the investment yourself. So yet another form of control. So essentially what I'm saying is, the trouble is that we have got sucked into that narrative. And that narrative is an imperialist narrative. And then we just protest saying, no, we need to develop, so we're going to do this and we don't care. And in other words, we treat it as a kind of defiance of that, saying that because we need to develop, therefore we are going to continue emitting. Whereas that's not really the story, right? We need to develop a story that recognizes the inequality within and between countries. We need to forget about this whole degrowth versus green growth. It's a complete red herring. I have good friends on both sides of the debate. The policy recommendations are the same. So can we please stop arguing about whether GDP should go up or down, because anyway, it's a terrible indicator. Let's instead focus on what we have to do, okay? We have to move away from an obsession with exports. And that's absolutely critical. I think some of you, we talked about this earlier as well. We have to reduce the foreign exchange dependence as far as possible, which also means then thinking of domestic or regional substitutes. We have to do whatever we can to get the latest technologies. We have to do what the rich countries did: copy, steal, emulate. We have to do all of that. They did it, we should be doing it. And because, let's face it, the world order is really messed up at the moment, it is easier to do it now than it has been for a while. We have to control the carbon emissions of the rich. And that's the rich in every country, not just in the US and Europe, the rich of our own countries as well, because it is extremely carbon emitting, the lifestyles and the patterns of investment. But all of this we can do within countries, but it doesn't work so well if you're just doing it in one small country and you don't really have that power. So you really have to combine. You have to get together, you have to cooperate. You have to actually think of doing things together as a strategic way to force the system itself to respond to those demands, okay? And there are many ways. You can do it for coordinating tax rules. You can do it in terms of controlling resource grabs. In Latin America, they are actually now much more aware of this, and they're combining to confront MNCs who are in the extractive industries. Something really that countries in Africa also need to consider. And you need to combine to address all the sovereign debt concerns, because just a small debtor on their own is not going to have a hope in hell to deal with the creditors. But a combination of debtors, you could still have some hope. My colleague in UMass Amherst, Nancy Folbray, she's a brilliant feminist economist. She has this wonderful saying: necessity is the mother of coalitions. And I think right now is really the time for coalitions. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jayati, for this really brilliant lecture. I particularly like the graphs you used. They are very startling, things you thought you knew already. Just looking at them there, I think brings a whole new picture. I also am very pleased that you focused on the legal instruments of climate imperialism, and most importantly, also about the things that we could do as countries in the global south, and the necessity for getting together to fight back on this legal terrain. So thank you very much. I'd like to open the floor now for any questions and comments that you might have after this lecture. Can someone help me with that? So just raise your hand, we'll bring you the instrument. Yes, please.
I think that's another dimension to there is there are two dimensions, one is economic and another one is political. It's also has to do with projecting political power over the global south. So when it comes to the subject's question, a lot of the solutions that are being proposed, which you say that are problems that are not prevented, it all when it comes down to the political possibilities of implementing them, and to the fact that starting the interest of the various countries to that. So maybe that's the greatest challenge. In my view, it's important that I like that to bring also not only the relation with team partner, but the relation with classes in the country as well. And those internal solutions are also needed. The challenge in regard to their limitations had to do with the interests of the people who work to farm. So appreciate that. And there's it's not a question of just what are the own solutions that should be implemented in their works, but the way through which we can attain the political power necessary to implement those solutions and to build as you really finish the coalition necessary. So I'd like you to actually
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Please come talking. After Nancy, come down here.
Thank you so much for a great lecture. My question is also maybe talking a little bit more about the response from the global south. I'll add a global one there. We've had a cholera outbreak in the Sahel region. 7 countries, I think, are quite badly affected. There was a head of state summit on this topic to deal with cholera. The statement that came out, first of all, started by blaming climate change for the cholera epidemic, then encouraged us to invest more in vaccines, and of course, we need to do more about water sanitation and hygiene, which I feel is really the problem. I think we're not talking about the new disease here, we're talking about cholera. And so it's really sort of this. And nothing you mentioned about this question around austerity, lack of finance, the debt constraints that prevent investment finance. So just generally speaking, when you said we have these contortions around how to explain problems and how to deal with them, where we I think the use of climate change, I'm not denying that, practices are not denied, but this is sort of upside down. So I think there's really one of the things, if you look at what side is doing for the global north, but I think the question of the global south report maybe giving a bit more examination to votes and how we can do more about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. That was really entertaining. Why? Because I spent about taking one on the day on climate change laws of the country. Yes, I was working on collections, on the collection. So some of these issues that we are talking about are still issues. But I am discovering that this issue of climate change is intricately linked to capitalism and colonialism. The same way colonialism was dealt with is also supposed to be the same way we should deal with this issue of climate change. The challenge now is that the global south nations and by communities, like indigenous, other communities, the ones that are bringing something, are not even aware. You see, when you look at this Mount it's not in Zimbabwe, which is one of the regions in Southern Africa that is the highest expected temperature rise. People there are suffering from climate change, but they don't even know that it's climate change. They think it's something else. So that is the reason why they try to see the global south is silent about some of this. Because it's only us experts to know about this animal of climate change. And people in the street, if you ask them what is climate change, they will tell you, they don't even know. So I I have been doing somebody saying that I discovered that climate change, as it is called, should be decolonized. There is need to be decolonized climate. Why? Because it's the very same nations, the very same individuals, times problem in the first place, and they are dictating solutions to address the problem that they created. And if they come with reasonable and holistic solution, it will deal a terrible lot of the profits. What they will present here for our profits, profits making and profit sharing is better than climate change feasible, climate change solution. But the major challenge also lies in global solution. We are silent about these things. For example, our government, Zimbabwe, we received about 108 million from Saudi Arabia in the past month as part of carbon offsetting in the organizational park area, one of the biggest conservancies in the world. But the communities, they will be forced to meet that. But it is these countries that are still coming up with these solutions. And the solutions are still there to blame other nations like what we are presenting. So I think we really need to be serious about this, especially us as academians. The same way colonialism was developing, the same way gender issues were developing, it's supposed to be the same way we should confront this, remove the hipocrisy, challenge the narratives, but we will not challenge them if we know what is really happening. The problem is that our representatives, our ministers, the people who got there to this whole service, they are not aware of most of the issues that there is. So they will just agree and decide some papers and think they've gotten a good thing for their time. What is the motive? What they are not aware. So the main onus as a to really expose this, to really expose the information that they are refusing to let out. Because it implicates one there, the cat is out of the bag. I think we will start to come up with really serious measures to address climate change. In my own opinion, I think it's climate coloniality by a rich few, not by families, but by super rich people. So it is done. Anyway, thank you very much.
Okay, so you speak and then after take it all the way.
So what I would say is that if the adaptation was as it is being already points without violence, it is simple. It is simple. And that's simple. It's the transit of source for some the expense of the object, which is a good assumption.
I think every time natural product this whatever crazy probably doesn't probably approach its problems. With regard to the policy alternatives that we give, not to say, but I like to approach it from the political economy of what's happening. 40 years of capitalism are very important. The only way today capitalism is able to accumulate profits is either through a regressive redistribution, usually I think through oil or electricity, or more spending and more spending. We are at a systemic level, there is no other way to show any form of time. And though there is some merit to the idea that the global order is at the moment of its place, for the third world to come out with a countermeasure, we need some sort of political such stability, which we ourselves are not able to speak for it. We are moving towards the right environment because of the policies in the political economy that we adopted. And the more we move right as a society, the less and less their interest in these policy alternatives. In such a scenario, do you think there is a political economy? I mean, so do you think there is a systemic way out of from a political economy? And if the system cannot get, shouldn't we be debating development as an alternative challenge to climate activism rather than development within climate activism?
Any more? Okay, so that's one, then when it's.
Thank you, Professor Bush, for the stimulating lecture. Two people. So many of the people with under capitalism are very problematic. They hide some of the environmental and social issues. But today, with respect to our control, it is achieved. Makes sense. There is a question to be about why don't we use the objects to be indicated that are already understood. Don't be next to the importance. So we are all about that taking the basic subjects, indicators that take social and environmental concerns. The second one is around consumption as the impact. And many of the solutions which I think I support this texting the beach, using the SDR or basic funds so that we can use this fund to deal with environmental issues. That is okay, but the other side of the debate is to deal with consumption. Raising more funds, probably you get more consumption. But funds is what
Please come to that one.
That there is a balance. My question is around this shift you propose from focusing on production-based, consumption-based. That's fine. But when we look at the time, in this really dire and isolated state, where massive amounts of people are. When you think of consumption and what we are consuming in order to survive, which is nature, water, it's land, it's all these kinds of things. What is the implication of I mean, we are not even, the question of consumer goods doesn't even enter into the equation for most of the time world. So, so there's a tension there. It's some of these minorities and thinking around taxation has actually been that we have to move actually when we're thinking of where we should be lowering the taxes, we have to pay attention to what people are consuming in order to focus on that. And because otherwise, it is kind of demonstration around taxes. So how do you make this happen? This
And then you look at this body. That's the expanse of analysis, that's the propositions. I agree that a similar point to what Lynn was doing. One of the data sets associated from the world in the quality was around foreign nations from the lowest to extent. Now, first of the way, this is a relative sort of fall, but I tend to think that there is an absolute fall also, because it's linked to what Lynn was doing. The fall in consumption and not consumption of goods here in spoke of goods from consumer good types. Basic surveillance. We see that in the effect. I'm sure that can be extrapolated, but I understand that the numbers, the analysis, that then goes to strategies, the propositions that you were presenting, which probably to center that aspect, how to grow consumption there, redistribution of consumption or culture. I just want to be on thoughts. It's extremely impressive that.
Thank you for my name is Martin. So we frame this problem in terms of climate periods. One comment has come that test that suggesting climate colonialism. Other more colonialism, not colonialism. So thinking why this framing gives us misunderstood why that frames for climate periods.
Thank you, presenter. That was a very articulate presentation. I have just a few comments. One which is to say that as countries in the global south, we've been on Western in terms of how we conceptualize and understand climate change. We've only understood climate change from a perspective that was receptive to us. We've never localized the definition of it, and we've never localized a model in which we can implement dealing with climate change. And for this reason, the elites, countries in the global economy, taking advantage of imposing frameworks and models which suit them better. So we need to tailor-make solutions and models that can be of use to Africa, because most of the models that are being proposed, they don't have, they are only helping other countries to make the most of a disparate situation. So as countries in the global south, we relate to ourselves. Then also, one other thing that as countries in the global south, we failed to capitalize, especially events that are taking place. Right now in Zimbabwe,
We have sunlight, but we are still using Chinese-made solar panels. We are still importing lithium batteries from China. So we have failed to invest, because this is an opportunity, instead of allowing countries in the global power to profiteer from the so-called alternatives. It should be us, African countries. We are reaching resources, but we are failing to make the most out of the situation, and then in the end, people are taking advantage of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think the thing is very I'd like to be there. So we may get concerns. Yeah.
Thanks so much for these very thoughtful and very interesting questions. Yeah, okay, let me begin with this. Why am I framing it as imperialism? Because for me, imperialism is a capitalist phenomenon. It's not, colonialism predates capitalism, actually. For me, the point about imperialism is that it is the struggle of large capital assisted by a state over other economic territory, over territories which could be physical, could be all kinds of other things, as we've said. But also imperialism doesn't mean that it's this country versus that country, because there are, in fact, workers in the north who are also badly affected by some of those processes. There are elites in our countries who are not just benefiting, but very much part of that process. So it's not, in that sense, it's not like a colonial war of independence. Unfortunately, it's more complex. You have to deal with your domestic baddies and the global baddies, right? And it's a much more complicated process as a result. So I do believe this is actually imperialism. I don't think it's colonialism. I mean, yeah, sure, there are colonial elements of it, in the sense in which we recognize colonialism, but it's not only colonialism. It's actually about the struggle of large capital and the states that are supporting that large capital. And they do all kinds of methods. Political control is often the least of those methods. There are many other. So the old kind of colonial struggle doesn't have the same traction. That's the thing. That makes our lives also more complicated and difficult. It doesn't have the same, you can't sort of, get the whole country against the colonial power, because it's expressed also through a lot of domestic powerful elites as well. So that's just to say, why am I framing it in this way? That was Adventino's question, I'm sorry. Yeah, okay. Yes, so I'm going to come back to that first question about it's not in the interests of the North, right, or of imperialism to give up, right? The empire doesn't give up, sure, absolutely. And I'm going to come back to that question because it links to the things that we should be doing. Nancy, you're right that we tend to leave out the real issues, but that's also because austerity is an imperialist device, but it's also a class device, right? And so the way it's projected, you want to minimize the role of those things. You want to minimize the role of progressive running down and hollowing out of public services, of underspending for decades on critical basic needs, et cetera, denying people the minimal wage goods that would enable them to develop their own survival mechanisms. And then you say, okay, so there was this thing, and now we have this disease. Yeah, so I completely take that point. But in the same way in which we try and spend our lives doing that, right? Calling that bluff. In the same way in which we call that bluff about austerity, we have to also call that bluff about the way in which, climate change is both being interpreted and addressed. So I would put both of them together. in the same thing, if you see what I mean. So to me, it's all part of that same complex thing that we have to deal with and address. But I completely take your point that that's, that the way it's projected is to underplay the other forces, which are policy-driven forces, and blame it on some other thing that is happening from out there that we have nothing, we, the government, we have nothing to do with. So yes, I agree with that. Yes, now there was this thing about climate change linked to colonialism and capitalism. Yeah, I mean, that's basically what I just said, right? That it's imperialism to me, is a capitalist phenomenon and so on. Is the COP model serious? I don't think it is. If it were, I think the last time it was serious was actually the Paris Agreement. I think that was serious. For some reason, we are not anymore in a world in which people see that you have to do something about this or else. I mean, they genuinely are not recognizing this as a problem of a precipice of humanity, which is why all these scientists are tearing their hair, that it's very serious. And I'm going to come back to then, therefore, what do we do in that sense? Somebody asked the question, okay, this question I do want to address, so why don't we make the alternatives to GDP more mainstream? Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I'm very much for that. There is a small, I would say, small bit of progress, I think, that has happened already in the UN system, which is, I'm part of a board in which we were asked to recommend alternatives to GDP, and we have recommended, I recommended 4. The group, we have recommended 5, and I'm happy to say that the UN Secretary General has agreed that he's put it into ECOSOC. ECOSOC is considering it. It will now go to the General Assembly. So we've said, look, GDP, everybody keeps measuring. Although we know it is so flawed, it is a terrible measure. And it's also methodologically suspect, right? I mean, all kinds of concerns with GDP, but everyone is so used to GDP, it was not go away immediately. So we're saying, in addition, the UN statistical system has to insist on these other measures. And if that passes in the General Assembly, then the UN statistical system will get every country to actually provide the data. What are the data? Number 1 indicator, the labor market indicator. The median wage multiplied by the employment rate. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us not the average wage, which is always inflated by the higher up, but the middle, below which half of the workers get the wage. The employment rate captures a whole lot of things. If you have a low employment rate, maybe there's a lot of unemployment, maybe there's a huge amount of unpaid labor, like in my own country. The lower your employment rate, the lower you will actually get of that number. So I did this exercise for that group to actually look at some countries, and the per capita GDP and this labor market indicator diverge completely for a very large range of countries. So you can have the US supposedly per capita GDP going up, the labor market indicator not going up. In India, it's the other way, ours is going down, while GDP is going up by 7%. So that's one indicator. The other one, the second one, is the proportion of the population that can afford the FAO's nutritious diet. Okay, and they have a nutritious diet which is location specific. They do it by sub-regions, okay? In India, the estimate is that 74% of the population cannot afford the nutritious diet. Our income poverty data, which is all crap, but anyway, they claim it's only 18%. So that is another indicator. The third is the proportion of time use, which means every country will have to do time use surveys. How much time are men and women separately spending on paid work, unpaid work, and personal and leisure time? Which is, the more unpaid work you do, the different nature, quality of life, and so on and so forth. The fourth indicator is just per capita food grain consumption, because the higher per capita food grain consumption is really because you're then using a lot of ecologically damaging livestock and so on and so forth. So there are several, if this goes through, actually there will be available data that at least we can use to lobby, at least we can use to argue that your government has not done what it says it would, and so on. I'm not saying that we'll get rid of GDP. It's obviously a very hard thing to dislodge. But at least we can create a policy discourse that isn't focused entirely on GDP. I think that's very important. Should we think of development, alternative development as a challenge to climate imperialism? So, you know, and here I want to get also to Lynn's question and the last question about Sandeep's question about the consumption of the poorest. I think I wasn't clear. What I'm saying is that in fact, the poorest are not the ones responsible for this, right? The poorest have got very, very low carbon emissions per capita across the world and in every region. And if you wanted to raise the level of everybody's income to get them above that global poverty line, you would really barely increase global emissions, only 5% increase. In other words, providing basic needs to everyone does not necessarily mean that you need to increase carbon emissions. So it's a red herring to say, oh, we have to increase carbon emissions because we need to develop. You can, if you want to do it, you can do it without very significant increase because it's already so low. So in fact, Lynn, what I'm saying is the opposite. I'm saying that in fact, those who are consuming in the bottom half of the global population, they are not the problem at all. They need to be they have to get access to basic needs, to a decent quality of life, et cetera, And the focus of the strategies, economic and other development strategies has to be that, okay? To control carbon emissions, focus on the rich. That's the point. Focus on the rich globally, focus on the rich in your own countries. That's where the control of the carbon emissions has to come, not from the poor. Whereas the way it's being done now, you have a carbon tax, you have a price on carbon, that's all deeply regressive. So I'm really saying you shouldn't do that. You should do the opposite of that. Which, in other words, I'm saying there's no contradiction. For me, you really have to, you can do it, but it means a political choice. And I think that comes back to the basic question which many of you have asked in very different ways. How the hell do you do it? Basically, right? You're saying, here is this global power, and it's also domestic national power, and so on. So I think first is that that we have to get the narrative. I really do believe this. I think that we have allowed a different narrative to become the popular narrative even within our countries. And our job is not just to be thinking of different things, but to go out there and sell that idea, right? To get that idea across to more and more people, which is a big job, which we have not done adequately so far. So I think number one, we have to change that narrative, recognize that the problem of climate is the problem of inequality. It's coming from inequality. It's driven by inequality. That's the thing you have to deal with. And there are ways to deal with it. Second, okay, how do you get the rich to give up their power, privilege, etc., either within your country or globally? And of course, we know it's not easy. But on the other hand, can we just sit around and wait for the greatest socialist revolution? I have been waiting too long, too many decades. So I am now thinking, how do we do little things, thin end of the wedge? What do we do to cause shifts? I mean, sure, I want socialism, but I'm old enough to know it's not going to happen in my lifetime. I want to see a few good things happen in my lifetime. How do we get those good things? I go back to coalitions. And they have to be issue-based coalitions. They can be countries getting together. I mean, Latin America is doing a tax agreement, which is really progressive at the moment. I told you in Africa, some of you, we were talking about this yesterday, the African CDC is actually doing really interesting and good stuff, even though many of the states who are part of the African Union are really horrible governments, right? On taxes, again, I mean, my own country, India, is absolutely the worst government in the world, but on global taxation agreement, they have a very good position. So I'm saying coalitions means issue-based coalitions with all kinds of groups. Maybe you have to hold your nose and hold their hand, but you have to have coalitions. You can't do this on your own. You can't do this by saying, I will only be pure and be with only the best and the most progressive and the most, etc. You have to join with whoever can help you to gain something in that particular arena, because let's face it, we are facing very big, very powerful enemies who are not going to give up without a struggle. So we have to be willing to be flexible and to join with many different kinds of groups and people for particular goals. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jayati, for this second round of discussion. So I think we are inching towards the end of this, this lecture. First of all, I want to ask us to really thank Jayati Ghosh for this brilliant lecture, for talking to us about a very topical issue of our time, climate imperialism, for raising issues that have provoked us to ask difficult questions, for responding to those questions in her usual gracious and eloquent style. I think we fulfilled the purpose of the Moyo lectures. We have had a leading scholar, activist, public intellectual of our times talk to us about a very topical issue and generated debates. In so doing, we have also made new friends by coming to the University of Zimbabwe. So this has been an amazing evening for us. I'd like to ask Walter Chambati, the director of SMILES, to come and give the vote of thanks before we close.
Good evening. Thank you, Chair. Firstly, I would like to thank our 7th Moyo Memorial Lecturer, Professor Jayati Ghosh of the University of Massachusetts, for a stimulating and excellent lecture. Thank you very much. We all know that you have a busy schedule. Thank you for taking time to be with us in Harare. Thank you very much for that. We wish you all the best in all your future endeavors. I also want to thank our hosts, the University of Zimbabwe, Faculty of Arts and Humanities. Please extend our appreciation to Professor Mangena for this kind gesture. We hope this is the start of a long-term collaboration with the university. Professor Moyo cut his teeth in the academy in this university. We hope this is just the start as we forge ahead with preserving the legacy of Sam Moyo. The University of Zimbabwe has to be part of that story. Thank you very much for hosting us today. I also want to thank all of you for joining us tonight, colleagues from the university, those who are with us at the Ideas, Political Economy of Other Development Workshop, and this SMILES Agrarian South Network Summer School. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. With those few words, I'll bring this to a close and wish you a very good evening. Those of us who are joining us tomorrow will connect in the morning. Have a good evening. Thank you.